Bien, nous allons commencer. Bienvenue, merci d'être venu pour écouter Michael Buckland, que nous remercions très vivement d'avoir accepté de venir jusqu'ici pour cette conférence sur l'expansion de la bibliographie. Et je voulais rappeler que Michael Buckland, qui était professeur émérite à l'université de Berkeley, a publié en 2017, c'est au MIT édition, un ouvrage que nous avons, Information Society, dont vous nous parlerez peut-être pendant votre conférence. Je pense que l'INSEE l'a acheté et que les étudiants auront beaucoup de profit, les étudiants et les élèves, à le lire. Voilà, nous sommes très heureux une fois encore de vous accueillir et de vous entendre pour cette conférence. Je donne la parole à Pascal peut-être pour la continuation.
Oui. Ben, je vais rapidement, Michael, merci Yves, présenter Michael Buckland. Michael pourra compléter s'il le veut, bien évidemment. Donc Yves vient de le rappeler. Michael Buckland est professeur, a été professeur pendant longtemps à la School of Information, l'université de Californie. Il a dirigé cette école aussi pendant longtemps. Il est américain, mais il est d'origine anglaise, donc c'est un Européen. Donc nous aurons aussi droit peut-être un anglais plus facile à comprendre, me semble-t-il. Il a une expérience dans le domaine des bibliothèques qui est riche, et il a notamment, on en a discuté hier, en particulier travaillé à la mise en réseau des bibliothèques des 9 campus de l'université de Berkeley, qui est une énorme énorme université, donc. Personnellement, pour moi, Michael Buckland, c'est peut-être très personnel aussi, c'est d'abord le théoricien du document. Il a publié un article qui a fait date aux yeux de beaucoup, et à mes yeux aussi, What is a document, qui était prolongé par un autre article, What is a digital document. Donc un spécialiste du document et de la documentation, et un spécialiste aussi de l'histoire du document. Il connaît très bien les théories de Paul Otlet, il connaît très bien aussi les théories de Suzanne Briet. D'ailleurs, il va faire référence, puisqu'on voit apparaître l'antilope dans le titre de sa conférence, à la célèbre antilope de Suzanne Briet. C'est aussi un spécialiste au départ de l'usage des usagers dans les bibliothèques et des services aux bibliothèques. C'est aussi un spécialiste, sa carrière a été longue et très riche, des systèmes d'information et de Public Information and Information Systems que je vais faire circuler comme livre. Une présentation de ces livres a été exposée dans le cadre de la bibliothèque, donc si vous voulez vous y reporter, c'est tout à fait possible, bien évidemment. Et puis, il y a un livre dont je veux parler, et puis qui est cher, je crois, à Michael Buckland. C'est son livre sur Immanuel Goldberg. C'est un livre assez exceptionnel. Là aussi, on en parlait avec Michael Buckland, de l'histoire de ce livre, puisque ce monsieur, Emmanuel Goldberg, c'est un peu un des grands oubliés du traitement automatique de l'information, de la sélection automatique de l'information. Et au fond, il a présenté une machine dès les années 20, fin des années 20, qui ressemble étrangement à la machine dont parle Vannevar Bush dans son article de 1945, As We May Think. Et on subodore, et Michael Buckland subodore, que Vannevar Bush se soit peut-être très fortement inspiré, même s'il n'y a pas de preuve, du travail d'Immanuel Goldberg. Alors, Goldberg était un juif russe qui s'est réfugié donc dans l'entre-deux-guerres en Allemagne, ce qui n'était pas forcément une très bonne idée, a priori. Et il a travaillé néanmoins pendant longtemps pour Zeiss, donc le grand spécialiste de la photographie allemand. Et c'est dans le cadre de cette entreprise Zeiss qu'il a mis au point sa machine, qui était une machine de sélection automatique de l'information et qui précède de fait les travaux plus théoriques de Vannevar Bush. Enfin, Yves l'a rappelé, Michael Buckland a publié l'année passée un petit livre qui est une sorte de que sais-je sur le rapport entre information, sciences de l'information et non pas médiatique, hein, mais information et société, donc Information and Society, publié aux presses du MIT. Je ne vais pas en dire plus, je vais laisser la parole à Michael Buckland, je crois que c'est ce qu'il y a de mieux à faire. Il est là pour nous parler de la question, juste 2 mots quand même, de la bibliographie. Alors c'est un mot qui peut paraître presque désuet, mais on va voir que grâce à Michael Buckland, ce mot apparemment désuet ne l'est pas, et qu'il mérite d'être pris en considération de vos frais, réhabilité, et que en fait réfléchir à partir de cette notion, ça permet d'aller très loin. Donc je passe tout de suite la parole à Michael Buckland. Michael, si vous voulez rajouter quelques mots sur votre parcours, votre biographie, on vous écoutera avec plaisir. Et puis ensuite, vous prenez la parole pour nous faire votre conférence. Merci, la parole est à vous.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be invited here. And when I received the invitation, it included the condition that I must give a talk. So the question was, what should I talk about? This is my second visit here. I spoke at a ISCO France colloquium in 1999, and I talked about vocabulary and indexing, and I also talked about the work of Suzanne Brouillet of the Bibliothèque Nationale. So what should I talk about today? Well, I did not know, but I thought that it should be something new and it should be something interesting. And when I talk to my students, especially doctoral students, I say, do not select a topic, you should select a problem. It's important to have a question, because if you have a question, then you know when you have found the answer and you can stop. That's really important. So I decided I should examine a problem, a question, but what would be of interest? Well, I did not know, so I thought, well, I will select a problem that is of interest to me. I'll work on that. And I'm going to talk about 2 anomalies in the field of bibliography. And I seriously regret that I am not speaking in French. The reality is that it was difficult enough to prepare this talk in English, and it would be impossible for me. My French is not adequate to present it in French, but as a kind of recompense, I will use French examples as much as I can. Here we have on the right an image from a T-shirt of students in a school of librarianship. Sometimes they have a competition to select the best design for a T-shirt in a school of librarianship, and one year this design won. Catalogue this antelope. And this is a stone associated with a dog. But I begin with the master, Paul Otlet. His first writing about bibliography in 1892 was called Un peu de bibliographie. And he introduces with this sentence, he says, there is a problem. And in the rest of the essay, he describes the problem, and then he spends the rest of his life trying to resolve the problem that he identified in this first paper. Now, my challenge, my problem, has to do with two challenges to the understanding of bibliography. The first one is by Donald Mackenzie. Donald Mackenzie was one of the most respected experts on the history of the book, of material bibliography. And in 1985, he gave a lecture, the Panizzi lecture, at the British Library. And I noticed that in the library there are 3 copies of the French edition containing his lecture, Bibliography and the Sociology of Texts. And in it he says, our understanding of bibliography is too limited. We obsess on the printed book. And that's wonderful, but it's not enough. Bibliography should be extended to other kinds of texts, including radio broadcasts, television, cinema, film, and culturally significant landscape, where the landscape has a cultural significance, patrimoine. This should be included. Now, this lecture and this idea is well known in the respectable areas of historical bibliography, material bibliography, analytical bibliography, etc. But I think that everybody says, well, it is an interesting idea, but at the same time it's a little bit absurd, and we do not know what to do. Earlier, Suzanne Bruyère, she published a manifesto in 1951. She was one of the first librarians, first women to be a librarian, professional librarian at the Bibliothèque Nationale. And Julien Cain asked her to establish the Salle de Catalogue, and that was her professional career. In 1951, she published this manifesto in which she declares all kinds of things, including the idea that an antelope in a zoo could be considered as a document. Now, this is now well known. People have heard of Suzanne Bruyère and her antelope, and I think most people say, well, it is an interesting idea, but at the same time it is a little absurd to think of bibliographies of animals, not bibliographies of books about animals, but bibliographies of animals themselves. And I think it is accurate to say that people do not know what to do about this. So my problem is, what are the practical and the theoretical consequences if you accept the advice of Mackenzie, or if you accept the idea in the manifesto of Suzanne Bruyère? Because in the end, it would lead to a unified framework for the description, the indexing, and the discovery of books and antelopes and cultural landscapes and everything else. And that seems to be a good ideal. I think Otley would like that. Mackenzie was talking of a specific rock, a stone. It's near Alice Springs in the middle of Australia, very much a desert. He says that bibliography should extend beyond books to all media, and including this stone with an unpronounceable name in the Australian desert. It is associated with an Aborigine legend about a dog. There was a big dog way, way back who lived here. And another big dog visited. And the visitor wanted the wife of the big dog. And so they had a big fight. And in the end, the dog was able to kill the invader, the dog that was coming. But he was very severely injured, and he sat down and he became a stone. This one. And if you do the correct ceremony, he will come back. When the first Europeans came here, the Aborigines tried to make the ceremony to get the dog to come back to make the Europeans go away, but evidently the ceremony was not correct and the dog did not come back, not yet. This is of interest for different reasons. Firstly, it is a legend. It is culture. Secondly, it is important because it demonstrates the relationship between the culture and the landscape. In Aboriginal culture, the landscape and the history, they are all combined together. But it also illustrates the difficulties of modern development, because the stone in the desert is now between the railway station and Pinky's Pizzeria. And this becomes an important site of conflict between the Aboriginal people and the modern European Australians who want to build buildings. Mackenzie likes to use the word text. So these are his words. Text include verbal, visual, oral, and numeric data in the form of maps, prints, and music, of archives of recorded sound, of films, videos, and any computer-stored information. There is no evading the challenge which these new forms have created. Actually, people have been evading the challenge, but they shouldn't. And then he says, the Aboriginal land, by virtue of the stories which the land holds, the codification and landscape of a whole tribal culture, it is the narrative power of the land. The land provides a text, some kind of text. Its textual status, which now supports a political structure dedicated to the belated preservation of the texts which make up a culture. I'll have a video. The argument that a rock in a Wunta country is a text subject to bibliographical exposition is absurd only if you think of arranging the text on a shelf. I will illustrate this rock.
Many ceremonies travel through the country of Mbantua and are passed on to other tribal groups who speak for these dreamers. One of these is the wild dog dreaming. A local dog and an intruder dog fought over a female. Their fighting and the eventual death of the intruder formed most of the features of Mount Gillen and many significant sites on the west side of Mbantua. After defeating the intruder, the local dog travelled until it reached its resting place and transformed into a rock embedded into the ground. Because of the town's location, this was one of the first sites to become unusable for ceremony.
before I get married. Today the boat not very much lately. The dog dreaming for this land is, I can't be custodian, and I can't tell them about nothing. All I know is a dog dreaming, where I come from. There's one dog coming with me, one dog. You see, it's on the chain at the railroad terrace. That I can't tell them, but it's a big story attached to that. But not for that. Allah ko yan, but the man given, Allah ko yan. Kaya the dingo is looking at the dingo from the Yippie, and the fire dog. But he brings up here.
That's where them two dogs had a fight at that place.
This afternoon, the public hearing moved here to Anzac Hill, where the traditional orator landscape was being pointed out to the court.
There has been an immense impact since 1860 through to today, caused by the settlement and development of this part of Australia, and particularly, of course, given that the plan before you centres upon Alice Springs.
And now we've finally been recognised here in town as traditional owners and custodians. There's been a long line of consultations going on around the town with sacred sites issues and things like that.
So that's the Dogstone. Now we go to Suzanne Brouillet, and in her manifesto, Qu'est-ce que la documentation, you have up here, une étoile est-elle un document? I can't read it. And galette roulée, well, you can read it. And later on, she discusses the article of an antelope of a new species in the Jardin des Plantes. I spent many hours trying to establish that there was a new species of antelope at the Jardin des Plantes at this time, but I'd never found it. Now, more interesting, in fact, than Suzanne Brouillet's manifesto is Robert Pagès. When he was a young man, he was a clandestine anarchist activist with the pseudonym Rodin. And when he was an older man, he was a famous researcher in social psychology. But in between the anarchist and the social psychologist, he was a student in the program of documentation at the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers, which later became the Institut National de Technique de Documentation. It was founded by Suzanne Brouillet and others under the auspices of the Union Française d'Organismes de Documentation, and Pagès was a student. While he was a student, he wrote 2 theses. The second thesis was later published as a book on classification in libraries and documentation. And the first thesis was published as an article in the Review of Documentation. That was the principal journal in the field at that time, published by the International Federation for Documentation. And it had the title Transformation documentaire et milieu culturel, Essai de documentologie. And it's the same ideas as Brouillet, but it is earlier, published 3 years earlier than Brouillet. if you want to know about Robert Pagès, Olivier Ledeuf has recently published a paper about him. And his examples of documents include no antelopes, but a gorilla in a cage, le chapeau de Napoléon, une momie anonyme d'Égypte, and a morceau de spat. But, unlike Brie, he provides an explanation and a discussion of that and much more. But I need now to take a little time to talk about bibliography, and I should emphasize I'm talking about the word bibliography. Originally, it was literally book writing, transcribing, copying in ancient Greece and in Europe. But in the 17th century, there was a new meaning. Instead of writing of books, it was used for writing about books, concerning books, a fundamental change. As far as I know, the earliest use of bibliography in this sense in France was about 1620 in Paris, in a Benedictine abbey, where the regulations said that the librarian should be versed in bibliography. Bibliotheca praefeciatur frater aliquis in scientiis et bibliographica versatus. The library should be administered by any monk who is versed, expert in knowledge and bibliography. And soon after that, Gabriel Naudet published a book, Bibliographia Politica. It's a literature review, so it's a form of bibliography. Originally it was in Latin, but then soon a French version was published. And so both of those are in this new sense of bibliography. At that time, a librarian, being a librarian was not a profession, it was a post, a position. And I don't know what the French term is, but in English one speaks of the scholar librarian. That is to say, somebody who knows a lot and has the position of librarian. And so if you want something, you ask the librarian, the scholar librarian. They were not so interested in catalogues. You asked the librarian. And he was the man who knew Historia Literaria, who knows the whole history of scholarly literature. And to do that, he must know a lot. So here's a nice little quotation on what it is necessary if you are going to be a librarian at that time. You can read that. That's from the famous Encyclopédie. But the scholar librarian is problematic. In terms of engineering, it does not scale. There's a limited capacity to what one person can do, and in engineering terms, it's subject to catastrophic failure. Because what if the scholar librarian leaves the library and goes to another one? Who do you ask? Nobody knows the collection. Or if the scholar librarian dies, or forgets, or goes senile. It's a risky business. And that was a significant reason for the development of librarianship, especially Martin Schröttinger in Bavaria, who developed the phrase Bibliothekswissenschaft, library science, and then later Melville Dewey and others developed technical systems, if you want, so that libraries could become self-service. Instead of depending totally on the scholar librarian, you need a catalogue. You can use the catalogue. All of this developed a great deal during the 19th century, and 1892 is a nice date to pick symbolically, because that was the year of the founding of the Bibliographical Society of London, dedicated, well, the first president made a conference in which he said, this is for intellectual bibliography and for material bibliography. But the members were not interested in intellectual bibliography. They were only interested in material bibliography. It was important at that time because with the growth of industry and wealth and the development of collecting old books became more valuable. And when something becomes more valuable, people will fabricate copies. And there were a number of embarrassing situations where people bought books that they thought were old, that were modern facsimiles. And also there was great interest in what exactly did Shakespeare, what was the text that Shakespeare really, really wanted to write when the printed works were a little different. So they did that. But that was also the same year as Otlay's Un peu de bibliographie, and he and La Fontaine in 1895 established the Institut International de Bibliographie in Brussels, and Herbert Field the same year established the Concilium Bibliographicum in Zurich, and the Royal Society had many difficulties trying to establish a catalogue, and many others. And the word bibliography has been used in many different ways. Some of the commoner ones are analytical bibliography, descriptive bibliography. It goes on and on and on. Many bibliographies, and they're a little different, and they change, and I forget which is which. So the concept of a bibliography, a thing, that's not in doubt. But the activity, the practice, that's much less clear. And Georg Schneider was invited to contribute an article to the Handbuch der Bibliothekswissenschaft, the encyclopedia edited by Fritz Milkau. This was in the 1930s, and he was asked, Georg, please will you write an article for the encyclopedia on bibliography? He did. His article basically says a bibliography is a list. But he was a good German scholar, and he used a lot of words. The English translation of the encyclopedia article is 300 pages, and it's not complete. Anyway, Schneider thought that this whole confused area of activity that is called bibliography could be sorted more or less into three emphases, three foci, three parts. There's the study of books themselves, which sometimes has been called bibliology, which personally I think is a very good name. In the time of the Bibliographical Society, this was very narrowly focused on material bibliography, but later it became much wider. You had the rise of the Histoire du Livre, and in the United States, one thinks of SHARP, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing, because you don't have books if you don't have anybody to read them, to buy them, to read them. So it is a broader context. And then a second emphasis is the practical matter of a useful list for people. And then there is the relationship between the printed texts and knowledge. A French example is Gilbert Varret, the Bibliographie et Savoir. This was his doctoral dissertation. He worked with Malclay. He was a specialist in the bibliography of the literature of philosophy, and this was a kind of introduction to his bibliography. It was published in 1956. Evidently, it is not a bestseller because it is toujours disponible. Today, you can buy a copy of the original edition, but it's a good example of that third category. So, in terms of the development of bibliography, there are different areas, and one can think of the top three. Most of the energy goes on to the problems of better technology, methods, standards, use of cards, and then punch cards, and now computers, and norms, and so on. A lot of activity, very important, very necessary. And then there is the extension of the idea of bibliography to other areas, like a list of films, sometimes called a filmography. And then there is a third category, theory of bibliography, and this is really, in my opinion, much neglected. A bibliography, a list, that's clearly understood, but this confusing area of activity, of process, that's much less clear. So our agenda, my agenda, is this concept of bibliography without frontiers. And there are four areas which I find interesting. One is the whole question of bibliography beyond printed books, including antelopes and dog stones. And then there is an area which is not clear to me, but much of the discussion has to do with concepts of evidence, that bibliography has to do or can do with evidence. Brier used this phrase, un document est une preuve à l'appui d'un fait. It's not her words, she is citing the words of une bibliographe soucieuse de clarté that she does not name. I wish I knew who it was, but I have not been able to find out. And then another area is the status of text and narrative. Certainly a printed text is that, but with Mackenzie in particular, he uses text in a very general sense, a bit like Barth. And then a bibliography is a kind of a reference work, usual, ouvrage à consulter, but in the literature, normally bibliographies are considered separately. But if they are a species of the broader genus, then maybe that should be explored. Now, there are some methodological problems in addressing this. And I think the French phrase reculer pour mieux sauter is good. Il faut beaucoup reculer for this. The most important is to try to remember the difference between things and their names. And remember that the terminology is not stable. I mean, originally, bibliography was the transcribing of papyrus. But then it was the describing of manuscripts, or printed books. So both the purpose and the material has already changed. And in information science and librarianship, it is full of figurative language. And that's dangerous, because usually figurative language is interesting, it's illustrative, and not correct. And it encourages careless thinking. And I think that another problem is that there has been too much enthusiasm for definitions. Definitions, as Mark Bloch, the historian, said, are a prison. They limit you. And when you are concerned with culture, with social and cultural matters, definitions are not effective. For example, if you pick a typical dictionary, it's clear it is a dictionary, there's no doubt. You recognize it. If you pick a typical encyclopedia, it's clear what it is. It is an encyclopedia, there's no doubt. But there are intermediate examples that are an encyclopedia that's a little more like a dictionary, and a dictionary that has more description becomes more like encyclopedia. There is a continuum. There's no frontier. It is not an archipelago, it's a landscape. And so normally in cultural discussion, it is much better to take a typical example, even an imaginary one, which is called an archetype, and you talk about the average Frenchman or the average Englishman, caricatures perhaps, but you can have a discussion like that. But definitions are a problem. And similarly, it is very easy to talk in terms of a dichotomy, to distinguish. There is something fundamental in the way we think that encourages us to contrast and make a dichotomy. But this is dangerous for the same reason as definitions. So we come back to the question of whether we should be concerned only with printed books. And here are two examples. The great Louise Noël Malclay says, "Nous employons bibliographie pour le texte imprimé seul, or toute reproduction assimilée." So she's clear. But this restriction is pragmatic, and she admits this. It's practical to limit to printed books. It's tidy, it's clear. And she acknowledges that, well, manuscripts, if you're dealing with bibliography and you are dealing with printed texts, if texts are important, you should include manuscript texts. And she says, well, yes, you should, but it's not convenient. We will call them something else. And then other people reject this. And I found this rather attractive account by the historian, the annales historian, Lucien Febvre. Well, you can read it. Un document d'histoire, cependant, millénaire. L'histoire fait son miel avec lui. And the whole purpose of the annales historians was to reject the German tradition of scientific history, which depended on authenticated documents, printed documents. And the annales people said, well, any evidence we can find, anything that the historian can interrogate, that's good. And this is an example. So this is not, well, perhaps it's pragmatic, but in a different sense. It is driven by the need for evidence. Now we have another example. I have an idea that this dictionary has some connection with Lyon. Anyway, in this dictionnaire encyclopédique des sciences de l'information, de documentation, you have a definition of document. And the definition has two parts, which I have separated by color. It's a support and it's ce qui enseigne. It's a Boolean definition. It's the red and the green. So the logical question is, what if you remove the red and you have only the green? Is it still a document? If it is not a document, what do you call it? And if the list is, if you take away the red and you use the green and you make a list, is it still a bibliography? Is it a documentography? What is it? And if you are really concerned with evidence, you must ask the question, what if it's not enregistré? So that is a formulation of the problem. There are some other important issues that I think are interesting to review. Now that data is very à la mode, of great interest, people assume that data is somehow different from documents. This is nonsense. And Jonathan Ferner at UCLA has written an excellent discussion of this. A data set is made up of documents, and the data set itself is a species of document. And I myself have written saying that data management is the area of bibliography that the bibliographies have ignored. And then there is another area that needs to be noted, because some authorities have liked to use the notion of graphic documents. The origin is that one can accept texts, but can you accept texts and reject diagrams and images? It's not a very comfortable idea. And so Jesse Shearer, for example, he is lyrical in his discussion of graphic documents. Bibliography is about graphic documents. And I think that Jean Mériat was the same, but I have not verified that. So that's one position. You have graphic documents and not graphic documents. Underlying this always is, where do you put the frontier? There is no good frontier if you want to go beyond text. And then on the other hand, following Fabre, you have that all objects considered to be signifying. This is the position of Pourrait, Pages, Mackenzie, and others. Now, the first time that I read Pourrait's manifesto, I was surprised by a distinction that she makes between an initial document and derived documents. She says that the antelope is an initial document, and a film of the antelope, a ticket describing the document, the antelope, a publication describing the antelope, these are secondary and derived documents. Now, I confess that this terminology was new to me, but it has some interesting possibilities. One is that this is exactly the approach used in biology, botany, zoology, where you must begin with a specimen. If you are interested in mollusks, you need a specimen, physical, an original, actual one. That is called the holotype. And you give it a scientific name, and you must provide a description, publish a description. If you don't do that, this species does not exist. That is the structure in biology. And of course, it connects with other ideas of provenance. Where does it come from? And one can discuss this in terms of Patrick Wilson's idea that mostly we depend on other people's knowledge, second-hand knowledge, and this is what fake news is. Fake news appears to be a derived document, but there is no initial document. That's how you decide, or that's how you try to verify that it is fake news. And then there is another area which is described not by Pourrait, but is described by Pagès. And this is a distinction between a particular, that is to say, a unique individual, and what I call a specimen. A specimen is an example of a set, of a group. Now, that is of interest if you are interested in information retrieval, especially information retrieval, because all systems for selecting depend on using the attributes, the characteristics of the collection, and therefore, if you want to be pedantic, retrieval systems only retrieve specimens. It doesn't matter, because if you pick a specimen, you can regard it as a particular. So I thought of a slogan, metadata makes specimens, but I do not think that will become very popular. And then there is the area, why do we have bibliography? Well, we do it for two reasons. We do it to describe things, but we do it because we want to select something, because we want to know something. And this is the perspective that interests me. I mean, it is dangerous. Ignorance is dangerous. Do you want a dentist that does not know how to do good work? I don't think so. If your automobile is kaput, do you want a mechanic that does not have the right manuals? I don't think so. If you are in a legal process, do you want a lawyer that does not know the most recent laws? I don't think so. Ignorance is important and expensive, and it is important for the individual, and it's important in other people. And Pagès discusses this a lot, and he makes a dichotomy between direct experience, l'expérience vécue, versus bookish learning, l'héritage livresque, what Wilson would call second-hand knowledge. And he says this was of interest to Descartes and other people. And if it is l'héritage livresque, you have to ask, well, whose knowledge is it? Who says? Patrick Wilson has a beautiful discussion of this. He called it second-hand knowledge, and recently André Tricot has been, and others have been writing about it. And the other aspect is what I like to call sense-making, sort of hermeneutics. If you have something, how do you understand it? If it signifies something, what does it signify? What does it signify that is relevant to you? Pourrait cited Pagès in her Kesakula documentation about introspection, about understanding things. He was a social psychologist, and he wrote a book about making sense, L'itinéraire du seul. And he also wrote a novel. It's about a young architect in Paris who has a crisis. He does not know what the significance of his life is, and he is unhappy and restless, and eventually he becomes connected with a guru who asks him awkward questions, and then, to his horror, his wife decides that she is unhappy and needs to discover the purpose of her life. You can understand, that could make a novel. The other thing that we must remember, and a big problem in information science, is that people want to make it science in a narrow sense. This is scientism, not science. Because what you believe and what you accept is influenced by what you want to accept. If somebody proposes something and horror, you want to reject it. Must I accept this? I don't want to. You will require much evidence, and perhaps no evidence is enough. But if you think it is a wonderful idea, you want to accept it. Maybe you accept it without any evidence. There is a big difference. This is an issue of trust that we find a big problem with the web. James Michener, who wrote so many good novels, when he was a young man, well, he wrote an autobiography, which is interesting. When he was a young man, he amused himself by acting as a fortune teller. I don't know, what's a fortune teller, Fidelia, in French? Somebody who tells you your future. And he would put on a funny hat and clothes, and he knew that if I went to you and I told you many things about your future, Michener says it must be at least 40 specific things I must say. If I say 40 things about your future, 1 or 2 will be correct, or they'll be acceptable, or you will be enthusiastic. You will not be interested in the 37 that are absurd, but you will obsess on the 3. This is the technique. But he found, when he did this, that she is so enthusiastic about this imagined future that she will take many actions to make it happen. She will spend money, she will change her life. And he decided this was so dangerous that he stopped doing it. And I was discussing with Professor Robert. Brillet talks about preuve. Now, the literal equivalent in English is proof. But I think that the English sense, proof, is more rigid, more limited, more strong than the French use of preuve. And Bernd Frohman has discussed this. He says that Brillet is too severe in her emphasis on preuve, and that a more relaxed, a softer notion of evidence, making, in English, if you say to make evidence, so to make evident, this is to show or to reveal. It's not logical proof. A reality of society is that society has become more complex through the division of labor. I do not think any of you constructed your automobile yourself. I doubt that you grew most of the food you ate, or created the textiles to make the clothes that you wear. You don't. Other people do it. And so as we developed from the time of Asterix to today, you have more and more specialization, more and more division of labor. And this depends on communication and collaboration. And in other words, it depends on documents. And it gets worse and worse, because especially with new technology, we are much more dependent on other people. I am much more dependent now than when I was a young man. Now, new technology brings new media, and it enables the creation and dissemination of new experiences or new forms of experience. Television, film, for example. And Pages discusses this, and he talks about mass documentification. So here's an example. He gives the example of Rocamadour. He says a major cultural change in modern times. It brings mass production, mass communication, total war, totalitarian regimes. Remember, he was born in 1919, just after the First World War ended. This was the period where you had the Italian fascists, you had the Nazis, you had the Soviet Union, and he was an anarchist, so he would be very sensitive to these issues. And also, that is the period of development of new media. And so he says that the new media allows the symbolization, he calls it, the creation of experiences, quasi-experiences, in the sense that they are artificial, and this fills the space between bookish learning and traditional lived experience. And so he says tourism is a good example. Rocamadour was a village that was not convenient to live in because it's vertical. But with tourism, it's a symbol of the heritage, of the patrimoine of Midi. It's changed its meaning because publicity of the tourist agency has made it a document, interpreted it. The article of 1948 by Pages is rather difficult. It's long and it's a little difficult to understand for me because it is in French, but also because the concepts are not very clear. So this is a double translation. It's a translation from French to English, but it's also my interpretation of his ideas, and maybe if he was here, he would not be happy. But this is what I think he meant. Back in the time of Descartes, you had a dichotomy between l'expérience vécue and l'héritage livresque. But there was an important cultural transformation beginning in the 18th century, accelerating in the 19th century, and then in the 20th century. And the elements of this include scientific experiments. Scientific experiments can be seen as the creation of experiences. You generate results that are new. If you will, it's a kind of artificial experience. And you have new media, and he mentions photography, cinema, radio, television, printing. I did not have space or the right vocabulary, but I mean half-tone printing, the printing of images and pictures, reproducing photographs and color. That is the 20th century development, in effect. And photography is older. The first photograph is usually regarded as 1835, but it was only in the 20th century that scientific effective photography developed. The first norm for the speed of a film was 1931. And then you have cinema and so on. These essentially were technological developments during the life of Pagès when he was young. And he speaks a lot of symbolisme combinatoire. And I think what he means there is that with the new media of the time, and cinema is a good example, you can take different pieces and you can combine them. You can make a collage at the same time, and you can change the sequence over time. And a film can be a good example of both of these. Either way, or in combination, you are creating the basis for new experiences. And also, if anybody in librarianship remembers Pagès, it is because he created an indexing language, a classification called Codoc, which had a very little vocabulary and very complex syntax to create the expressions. And you have an increasingly totalitarian society. Travail de masse, politique de masse, guerre de masse, guerre totale. It's not simply that you have fascist regimes. It is that society is becoming more totalizing, even in a democracy. We see this with the new social media. Pagès would look at social media and he'd say, I told you in 1948, this is what is happening. It's not a utopian view. For him, it's as much dystopian. Anyway, the combination of these developments change. You have a continuum of document and experience. So, l'expérience vécue and all these quasi-experiences sort of go together. It's difficult to know what is the real and what is the quasi. And at the other end, you've got the héritage livresque, but you've got so many other media that it blends together. You have a continuum. And one consequence of this is that whether at this end is printed on paper or not printed on paper is really not very significant. I mean, it is of technical interest, but that is not what is most important. So you have a change from a dichotomy to a continuum in which, whether it is printed on paper or not, is not the most significant aspect. So there's more to be said about texts and narratives, evidence and meaning. I believe that meaning is constructed. It's a sort of semiotic, hermeneutic approach, but it's important. And when you think about the dog stone, here you have a stone that has a narrative associated with it. if you doubt that it was a dog that became a stone, still you can accept there is a narrative that is attached to the stone. A striking example of this is Masada. I don't know whether you know Masada in Israel. It's astonishing. It's a mesa with very steep sides. It's a spectacular place. And in the year 72, I think, some Jews, a group of Jews who did not want to accept Roman power, they went there to the top and they rejected the Romans. The historian Josephus has an account of this. And according to Josephus, the Romans, in the end, they put stones one upon the other to make a ramp. You can still see it. It was an incredible amount of work. And when the Roman soldiers got to the top, they found that nearly 1,000 of the Jews had made mass suicide. This was politicized by the state of Israel as a heroic political gesture. If you want young men to or women there to become soldiers, you take them to Masada and you induct them into the army in the spirit of Masada. At the same time, the archaeological evidence says the opposite. There were very few human remains found by archaeologists, and they were not Jewish. And Josephus' detailed description of Masada is not accurate. So here you have a conflict between the most powerful, heroic legend that is used to identify the country, and you have evidence which indicates otherwise. And this is like souvenirs. This is some kind of mollusk. If it goes into a natural history museum, they will decide it's like an oyster, but it's too big. And it's not from the sea, it's from a river. I have no idea what species it is, and I don't care. I'm not interested. So why do I have this mollusk? I have had this mollusk in my house for nearly 50 years. Why? It is a question of context. It is a question of perspective. In 1972, I came from England to the United States. My wife, my daughter, my son, our cat, and myself. We went from Lancaster in England to Indiana, where I went to work in a library. And soon after we got there, it was a beautiful day and we had a picnic. We went to a park by the side of a river and we had a beautiful picnic. And I picked this out of the river as a souvenir. Now, until today, nobody would know that this signifies the happy memory of the transhumance of Buckland family to Indiana. But, and if it is in a museum of natural history, it's a mollusk. But if we had a museum of the Buckland family, I like that, Musée Buckland, I like that, then you would have to describe this in the context of the narrative associated with it. That is why it is important. Another thing that occurs to me, most people have ideas about the narrative associated with books that they have not read. Think about it. I think most people have some ideas about what is in Mein Kampf, but they've not read it. In the United States, they are obsessed with the text of the Constitution, but mostly they have not read it, or they read it when they were very little in school, or the Quran. People have ideas about what is in the Quran. It may be accurate, it may be not, but they have not read it, but it influences their behavior. It's part of their knowledge. So if reading is not necessary to have a meaning about a text, why limit bibliography to texts unless you are actually a specialist interested in texts? Now we come to bibliographical references. An item in a bibliography or a bibliographical citation mentions some other document. You can use different words. It's a mention, it's a reference, maybe it's an allusion. You can refer to a document without exactly giving its name. And so this is the most minimal, most fundamental aspect of bibliography. You mention. If you have a very, very long book, and in the middle it mentions one other book, only one, is that a bibliography? Well, it's not usually a bibliography, but that little part of it is bibliographical. So it's a little bit a bibliography. A bibliographical mention is a reference, and there's an etymology of reference. It's from the irregular Latin verb ferro, ferri, tuli, latum. It carries back, and the past participle latum means that it has been carried back. It means a relationship has been established. Referring and naming are almost the same. Naming is a very unclear area of linguistics. The linguists seem to not quite know what to make of naming. They call it nomination, but that doesn't solve the problem, changing its name. And so referring and naming are very close. And if you mention something, you do not necessarily convey meaning. The pioneer of documentation, Robert Fairthorne, the Englishman, he was very clear when he wrote. Anything he wrote is good to read. And he discusses this. He says, mentioning does not convey meaning. It establishes a relationship only. This is very, very important when you start to use technology, because if a computer mentions something, it does not mean that it is conveying meaning. Okay, so we're talking about bibliography, and I have been talking about the biblio. What about the graph, the graphing? What is written? And it seems to me that this covers a number of things: referring, mentioning, alluding, representing. You represent. If you have a bibliographical description that is more than minimal, it is a representing. And that's the normal sense in bibliographical work. Perhaps copying is an extreme case of representation. There is enumeration, where you have more than one representation, a list. And you make lists, sets of records. Georg Schneider said bibliography is about lists. And description, descriptive metadata, that can be used to create subsets and selection. And then there are all kinds of possibilities for effective presentation, visualization, and so on. Now, my former colleague, Patrick Wilson, certainly one of the most intelligent person that I ever met, he wrote a remarkable book, Two Kinds of Power, an essay on bibliographical control. It is difficult to read, but it's brilliant. And he says that bibliography, bibliographical control, has two functions, two purposes. They're not the same, and they're not completely independent. One is to describe, and one is to exploit, to select. In addition to describing, you use bibliographical apparatus to select the best documentary resource for whatever your purpose is. He called them describing and exploiting. Now, he used the word power. Today, academics are more likely to use the word affordance. This is a fashionable word now, but it has about the same meaning. And my favorite example is a speed bump. I think this is the French for a speed bump. You would say figuratively that a speed bump slows down automobiles. That's figurative. The speed bump does not slow down automobiles. Speed bumps cannot drive an automobile. But a consequence of the existence of a speed bump is that it damages the voiture, and so the driver will go more slowly. So that is an effect that follows from the existence of the speed bump. So I thought, what are the affordances, the powers of bibliography? And in order to be more complete, I decided that there were 6. I think Wilson would say, well, that's fine because your purpose is different from his. One is that of revealing or describing. That was his first. But also, bibliographical descriptions are used for disambiguation. It's not the same as describing. Now, they're related because usually you increase the description to achieve the disambiguation, but they're not the same. And then it can be a surrogate for some purposes. If you look in the library catalog or a bibliography, that's enough. It depends what you want it for. And sometimes the original is not available or no longer exists. So you must use the surrogate. And then there is the use of the bibliographical material for search and selection. That's Wilson too. But the other thing is that the creation of the descriptions establishes all kinds of possible relationships that you can use and analyze. And in addition to that, you can do statistical analyses of any kind you want. I mean, look how excessively fashionable citation analysis is. And it can be quite qualitative. This is something that Varé discusses. He says, if you are an expert in some specialty and somebody shows you an article and you look at the references only, you will have an understanding of what the article is about just by looking at the microbibliography, he called it. So I thought, well, this is Buckland's 6 affordances. Now here I need to stop and talk a little bit about perspective and intention. And perspective is very important. It has to do with purpose and so on. And in information science, it has been dominated by transmission. Shannon's communications theory, later wrongly called information theory, and you have a source and a message and a recipient. And for engineering, that is enormously important. If you are a telephone engineer, etc., it's enormously rich and important in engineering, but that's not the same as librarianship. And in communication, you just multiply transmissions. And so if you're interested in mass communications. It's a matter of a source diffusing messages in all directions. And if you accept that, then logically you have the unhappy recipient being bombarded here. And I guess if you are interested in mass communication, that's okay. But if you are interested in becoming informed and learning, this is completely wrong. Because if you construct meaning, if you take a sense-making, a hermeneutic approach, it's an active engagement by the subject. It's not just a passive recipient being bombarded with communication rays. It's an active one. So we need something like this. And the perspective and how you view it changes how you understand things. I like to tell my students that the word theory has an etymological origin that's the same as theatre. It's a view. And I like the story of the Frenchman who decided to visit England. So he went to England, and when he came back, they asked him, "Did you like England?" He said, "Well, I did like England, but the English are strange. They are different from the French. Why, for example, in Paris, we celebrate great military victories, Austerlitz and Jena. But in London, they celebrate great military defeats like Trafalgar and Waterloo." Question of perspective. So this is a little summary of my assumptions. The meaning is constructed. It's a semiotic approach. And to construct meaning, you have two elements. You have the reasoning and you have the evidence. Evidence is perceived, what you suppose is evidence, or you suppose enough that it is evident. And meaning can be thought of as a narrative, like observing the antelope to understand antelope behavior. And you have the association of meaning with object, and the dogstone is a good example of that. And texts, including books, they're not different. You can associate meaning with books, even if you do not read them or understand them. The bibliographical records describe, refer, and name both an object and any associated narrative. If you wanted to describe this in the Buckland Museum, I like that, you need to describe the picnic and why it is important, because moving to the United States was a good experience, even for the cat. Bibliographers describe documents. Now, if we change the definition of documents, we're going to change the meaning of bibliography, or we require a different name from bibliography. Well, that is theory. In practice, how would you describe an antelope as a document? I mean, if this was an exam and I was the professor and you're the students, and I say, right, make a bibliographical record of an antelope. Well, what would you do? The Bible in the United States is the Chicago Manual of Style. That is all things including bibliographical description in enormous detail. It says nothing about antelopes. I looked. Nothing about animals, nothing about stones. Only printed books and manuscripts and maybe sound recordings. No help. But I began as a cataloger in a library, and I know that library cataloging codes, they provide for the description of three-dimensional objects and realia, things, real things. But it's what I've looked at is really not helpful. It's not designed. It's for jigsaw puzzles and games and other products. It would be it's no good for antelopes or dogstones. However, there are other possibilities, because there are other reference works that are being used for this. So, for example, The antelope is an animal, so perhaps instead of the Dublin core, you could use the Darwin core, which is what people who document animals use. There, how about that? That's lovely. Antelocapra americana. Antelope is not a precise term. There are many, many species that have been called antelope. So, but this is nice. And you have lots of details of the classification, the geographical extent, when it lived, and so on. That's much better than cataloging realia. Well, what are we going to do with the dog stone? Darwin core is no good for that dog, I don't think, even though it was a dog. So perhaps a toponym directory. In America, we call it place name gazetteer because it was newspapers that developed place name directories. So they're called gazetteers. Nobody else knows that, so I use toponym directory. And maybe the Getty Thesaurus of geographical names, although when I looked at it, I'm not so sure. They're much more concerned with artistic creations than a dog legend. This is a beautiful book. I like this book very much. The Oxford Illustrated Literary Guide to Great Britain and Ireland. And it's a list of places that are associated with authors, with publications, the plots of stories. I was reading Anthony Trollope about an imaginary place in Barsetshire. It's actually Salisbury, and so on. So this is places associated with books and authors. So is it bibliographical? Well, yes, it is, because if you look at it, you find books, but it's also biographical because it is about the authors, and it's also geographical because it's about the places, and it's historical because it's about what has happened, and it's literary because it's about literary works. So this is another reason why bibliographies are not fully separable from other reference works. So if we have a general theory, if like Einstein we move from the special theory of bibliography to the general theory of reference works, what affordances do they have? Well, it will not surprise you that Buckland decided on these 6, and guess what? It's the same 6 for bibliography. And what I did was, I made a little chart. I put some things, and then the genre of reference work, and then does this genre do these affordances in this case? And it seemed to me that the answer is yes, or possibly, or potentially yes. Now, there's very, very little work on the theory of reference works beyond saying they are a list and you can consult them. But it seems to me that they are the same. And a few years ago, working with a group, we tried to develop more powerful support for searching in library catalogs. And one day we decided that we would try dividing into the facets of what, where, when, and who. And library cataloging is not good for places. It uses the names of political jurisdictions, and they change, and they have multiple names, and so on. So we decided to separate these and do them separately. So the library catalog, you have the subject, we'll call it what. What is a little difficult, but it's what. And sometimes there is a geographical subdivision, and sometimes there is a chronological subdivision. I put facet because subdivision is too long, and sometimes there is a personal name. It's possible. And in a toponym directory, you have the place name. But you have the type of place name. Well, it's an island. It's a city. It's a mountain. It's a lake. Geographical feature type. And then you have where it is. You have usually the latitude and longitude. But if it is done well, which usually it is not, you need to say when. For example, Toulouse. You know where Toulouse is now. But in Roman times, Toulouse was Tolosa, and it was a few kilometers different place. And if you're looking at Lyon in the 16th century, I'm sure it is smaller than Lyon now. The characteristics change. So if somebody says, when was the Stone Age? Prehistoric. The only way to answer that is to say, well, what part of the world are you talking about? Or a better example, if somebody says, when was the Civil War? Well, in Spain, it's the 20th century. In America, it's the 19th century. In England, it's the 17th century. It all depends on the where. And it's imaginable that a person could be significant. And we also experimented with what we called time period directories, a dynasty, the reign of a king, a war, or some event. And you can construct these very similarly to the toponym directory. Obviously, you have the name. It is the 30 Years' War. And it's a war, or you could have the Fifth Republic, and then that's a period of a constitution. And you have a calendar time, but it's only meaningful in a geographical position. And maybe there's a significant person like the king. And then biographical dictionaries. Biographical dictionaries are really interesting, but there's been very little work studying them. A collection of biographical details, prosopography, is fashionable in history. But we decided that a biographical dictionary is arranged by who, and it is possible to analyze it in terms of units that are tuples. You know who, what activity, where, when, and maybe somebody else. Okay, Emanuel Goldberg was born in Moscow in 1881, and his mother was involved, I'm sure. And you can use this kind of structure. Now, what is interesting about this, and I've used color coding, is you get the same ingredients in all of them. So although you put the geographical material here and the biographical material there and the historical chronological material over there, and in each, the biographical are normally arranged by the name of the person and the geographical by the name of the place. Inside, in the details, you have the same elements. And so I can rearrange this and make a schema. You see, I've just rearranged the same elements. And vertical links like that, they connect to additional resources on the same one. If you want to know more about the place, you can look in these other ones. You can combine, for example, a toponym directory for a place, and through the name you can go to the catalog to find literature about the place, and so on. And within any reference work, horizontal connections within the entry, they provide context. And this has sort of mesmerized me, it's in my little book, I put it in. The logic of this is that all reference works are composed of the same elements, and in principle, each reference work is based on all knowledge, or differently stated, they're all based on the same knowledge, very selectively. And a corollary of this is that if you have an inconsistency, then that is a problem. And the differences between them depend on the purpose and the economical considerations. So in practice, bibliographies are a species of reference work. The primary characteristic is there's a list structure for selection. Conventional bibliographical practice is not currently adequate for describing it. Well, we know that. And they have the same characteristics in detail. So in summary, if you have an emphasis on becoming informed, not on communication and not on information, you change your perspective from communicating to learning as an active engagement. It's useful to have a distinction between sense-making and evidence, and you can include whatever forms of evidence that are necessary or helpful. Discussing by archetype, not definition, is better. You need to emphasize the narrative, not the text. And actually, there's no need for a text, just the objects, like the antelope. Bibliography is inherently historical because it is about what has been published. It's constructive, you're constructing a list. It's interpretive, you're making descriptions. And it's philosophical in the sense that it's about knowledge. This was a point that Barry liked. But other reference works are too. So bibliographies are reference works. So we have the conclusion. Use document for any objects worth considered signifying. You treat printed books as a species of document, and you separate books as objects, material bibliography, very important, very respectable, from evidence for or about scholarship, intellectual bibliography, and you can default to access to all genres. You can see it treated as a single universe, and maybe you should avoid the word bibliography. Pages and Brie preferred documenting and documentation. If you want some semantic hygiene, and you go back to Georg Schneider's Trinity, subject bibliography and the making of lists could be called documentation. Pages and Malclay use documentography, and the study of books. I think bibliology is better, but many other people have said that. But I'm not optimistic that anybody will change the terminology. So the situation is that bibliography can be used as a synonym for documentation, or only graphic records like Shearer and Merial, or for printed documents only, and then you have other categories, or simply the study of the physical book. It doesn't matter, really. What matters is you distinguish between the thing and the name. Finally, so in terms of Schneider's Trinity, the study of books themselves, the dogstone is irrelevant, an anomaly. Throw it away. In terms of the making and using of bibliographical lists, the dogstone and the antelope are irrelevant, anomalies. I just throw them out. But I suggest, when it comes to subject bibliography, representation of knowledge and evidence, limitation to printed documents is the anomaly. And I began with Paul Ottley, so I will end with Paul Ottley. So thank you. And if you want to send email, it's there.
Donc si vous avez des questions à poser, alors vous pouvez les poser en français, vous pouvez les poser en anglais, bien évidemment. La réponse sera en anglais aussi.
I think everybody is tired now.
L'exposé était très riche. Arthur Perret.
Bonjour, donc Arthur Perret. Je fais une thèse avec Olivier sur Paul Hotelet. Et donc j'ai épuisé mes doigts à noter tout ce que vous avez dit. La conférence était extrêmement intéressante. J'aimerais que vous précisiez, si vous voulez bien, ce que vous entendez par expérience artificielle. Et en fait, ma question derrière, c'est comment on dépasse une expérience artificielle? Comment est-ce qu'on dépasse ce blocage qu'on a dans notre monde actuel? Parce qu'on bosse sur Paul Hotelet et ce qu'il écrit dans le traité de documentation, l'hyper-documentation, l'hyper-intelligence. Est-ce que c'est ça qu'on a derrière quand on aura dépassé une expérience artificielle? Est-ce que c'est ça qu'il faut qu'on essaie de chercher, une expérience authentique? Je sais pas.
If I understand your comment correctly, the terminology of artificial experience and quasi-experience comes from Pages, but I used it. It seems to me that it is useful in two ways. One is in the example of scientific experiments. If you make a scientific experiment, then you get a result, something you experience, that you have created through the experiment. So it's not an accident, it's created. And in that sense, it's artificial. I mean, you experience it, and it's not artificial in the sense that it is not real. It is real. And he uses quasi-experience to, if I understand Pages correctly, for the consequences of all forms of new media. So, for example, if you see an accident, two voitures go together, that is lived experience. If you go to a cinema and you see a film of two cars, that is an experience that is very realistic, but it's not the same as two real cars having an accident in front of you. And especially if it's with digital, maybe there was no two cars who had an accident, but you create a virtual reality. And so Paget's argument is that a powerful consequence of the rise of new media is the possibility of having realistic images, experiences that have been created. And I think that is what he means by quasi-experience. But Olivier has read this article, and you should ask him, because it is not easy. By the way, I prepared a text of my talk, but it's not complete. It needs to be revised, but sooner or later I will complete it, and I will send a copy to Pascal Robert.
Notre.
Thank you for your speech. This was very interesting. I'm associate professor in Lyon 3 University. I have a question about the place of the experts and about the place of everybody and the position of the experts, considering that if the document, the quasi-empirical documents you were talking about, like legendary story, piece of art, a village as Rocamadour and everything, what is the sense of somebody which is visiting the Rocamadour village and that wants to give an advice to another user, or where is the place of the experts in the experience of these quasi-empirical documents you were talking about?
Where is the place of the expert?
What is the role or the place actually now? The role of the experts?
It is the subject. I mean, Rocamadour is still there. I went to see it. It is not that Rocamadour has changed. It has not changed. Well, it has changed a little bit because of the tourist industry, but basically it has not changed. What has changed is the way that it is regarded.
Yeah.
And the tourism industry wants to make money, so they have a financial interest in persuading you that Rocamadour is not just an inconvenient village, it is an exciting, interesting historical experience. And then you will go and you will give money and so on. Now, the role of the expert is a little questionable here.
No, I mean, I will try to reformulate, like,
yes.
If we consider Rocamadour as a document, if we consider that multiple viewpoints about this document is interesting, and that these multiple viewpoints can be produced by everybody, even if it's an expert or a user, where is the use of the expertise of the expert knowledge in the documentarization of this quasi-empirical document as Rocamadour village? Sorry.
I think that I am a little bit cynical. I am a little bit skeptical. I think that there are two elements here. You have the historian who is very serious and tries to make a historical study of Rocamadour, maybe archaeologist and so on. And so the expert will have some narrative about the history of the village. It will be incomplete necessarily, and perhaps it's not accurate. A younger, later historian will say, no, it's a little different. So expertise is always provisional. People forget that science is about falsity. The objective in science is to prove that the ideas are false. The second expertise is that whether the publicity by the tourism people is effective or not depends on the expertise of the people making the propaganda.
D'autres questions? Sinon j'en ai une, mais vous d'abord.
Hi, Mr. Buckland. I thank you for your talk. I have a very simple question. When it comes to physical bibliography, and we have an e-book in our hands, can we talk of physical bibliography? Or does the digital aspect of the e-book take away all of the information that an ancient book can have and hold in physical bibliography?
The fact that it is an e-book is not important. Well, it's important because it's convenient to have an e-book, but it is not, fundamentally, it is not relevant because an e-book is a physical object. You try to use an e-book with no electricity, it's physical. There's an enormous conceptual problem that if you use digital media, it is virtual and somehow it is not physical. This is total nonsense. It is absolutely physical. It is just that the physical characteristics are different from paper in important ways. You can be more flexible with digital material, but it is very difficult to preserve. There are no good solutions to preserve digital documents, and that's a disadvantage. And if you have no electricity, digital documents are not easy to read. So it has the appearance of being different materially, and the characteristics are different, but they're still absolutely physical, but with different characteristics.
Une autre question? Sinon, moi j'en avais une, effectivement. À un moment, vous avez dit distinguish names and things. Est-ce qu'avec le numérique, cette distinction ne devient pas difficile à faire? Isn't it difficult to make the difference between names and things now in the digital era, in fact?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, a big problem in the field of librarianship and information science is that words have been used without enough care. The word information has been used with many different meanings, and people have not been careful to specify in what meaning, what sense they are using the same word. It would be a good idea to abolish the word information, but it's not going to happen. The fact that something is digital changes the characteristics, but it's a matter of terminology, and it's a matter of clarity in one's thinking. I'm not sure this is an answer to your question, but it's an observation.
Ma question, c'était plutôt dans le monde numérique, pour que les objets existent, sur un mode numérique, ils ont besoin d'être nommés, justement. Donc il y a une sorte de continuité entre le nom et la chose. Et dans le monde réel dans lequel on vit, les objets qui sont commercialisés sont dotés d'étiquettes, et ils n'existent que par les noms et les codes qu'on appose sur ces objets. Donc là aussi, dans l'autre sens, il y a une solution de continuité entre les objets et les noms, et j'ai l'impression qu'on est moins dans la distinction entre les noms et les choses, entre les mots et les choses, que dans un monde dans lequel il y a une solution de continuité, une double solution de continuité, des choses aux mots, parce que les choses dans le monde numérique ne peuvent exister qu'avec des mots, qu'avec des codes, et que parce que les choses qui existent dans le monde dans lequel nous sommes, elles sont saisies à travers des codes et à travers des mots. Donc ça crée une nouvelle relation, une nouvelle dialectique entre les mots et les choses, qui n'est plus une distinction justement, mais qui est vraiment une dialectique de l'un à l'autre et de l'autre à l'un, en quelque sorte. Voilà, c'était ça ma question profondément.
I don't know. I'm not sure I understand your question, except that if it is numérisé, it is very dynamic and unstable. I do not have an answer for you.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions?
Maybe the last one. You just mentioned that the conventional bibliography is not accurate for describing objects, and it seems true. Objects are quiet, even mute, they don't speak to us. Maybe they speak, but we don't understand them. They don't have legends, titles, dates. So the few characteristics that you just mentioned and you face it to describe them, what, who, when, and where. Do you think is it enough to extend the notion of bibliography to objects?
I think that whether you are, when you are describing anything, whether it is a printed book or printed something else, or an animal, or a legend. If you do a rich, full description, you will probably include the material, what kind of thing, who is associated with it, where it exists, when it exists, at least those four and probably more. I am saying that I think that it is helpful to use these facets when you are making descriptions. The origin of this was in terms of library catalogs. They're not good for searching by place. They could be. They could be very powerful if you connected the geographical subdivision with the toponym directory, because that would tell you physically the space, and it could give you examples of where it is. I'm not sure this is an answer to your question, but I'm saying that whatever it is, if you make a rich and complete description, you are probably going to need to include the geographical considerations, historical people, and what kind of thing, whatever it is about. And therefore, you could have better systems for description and search if you provide the structure for examining these different aspects. This was very much the origin of our ideas. If you want to know about what castles, Chateau Fort, there are in some part of Austria or the Dordogne, a library catalogue is not very effective for that. They will use the modern political jurisdiction, which department, not the medieval period. And they will use the modern name, not the name that was used in the past. And for that, a good toponym directory is a better tool, so you should use it, and you can connect it. That was how we became interested in this. For me, it was a revelation what a good toponym directory can bring to you. I'm not sure that is an answer to your question or not, but that is the origin of it.
Une autre question, peut-être une dernière question.
I have a question about a new technology which is among us, the glasses for virtual reality. And thanks to those glasses, we are able nowadays to see, for instance, the metadata of objects. For instance, for this table, the dates of construction, the provenance, and things like that. And according to you, does this technology is a move towards having a bibliography beyond books? Thanks to all those metadata we can see on objects.
I would make two comments. One is that virtual reality is a form of visualization. In principle, it's the same as making an image, but it's just on steroids. It's more powerful, but in principle, it is an image. As the cinema is more effective than just a drawing, virtual reality is a sort of super cinema. So in that sense, it's not different. It is just a more extreme example. And therefore, we need to find ways to describe and select these. And so therefore, the arsenal of bibliography needs to be applied to it. Now, the relationship with metadata is a little more complicated. I mean, if you have a book, some of the metadata of the book is inside the book, on the title page or the achevé d'imprimé and so on. And if you have a document that's numérisé, then perhaps you will have more of this data. So I think that it is not fundamentally different, it is just a more developed case.